Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On the morning of December 7th, 1941, America was surprised by a terrorist attack from Japan. That morning, Japanese kamikaze struck Pearl Harbor, a naval base in Hawaii. This devastating attack would soon lead to the horrible beginning of Japanese-American racism, propaganda, and ultimately internment camp. After the bombings at Pearl Harbor, there was a severe increase in racism toward Japanese Americans. Many signs began appearing on storefronts around the country saying things such as, "Japs keep moving, this is a white man's neighborhood," or "We don't want any Japs back here, ever." They began being on the same level of racism as African Americans in this time. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the political and military leaders were taking preparations to prepare for an all-out attack on the West Coast based on Japan's military expansion in Asia and the Pacific throughout the recent years. Public opinions following the attack are in good standing with the Japanese Americans. They were called good Americans, and many others believed that they had strong loyalty to the United States. However, 6 weeks after the attack, public opinion quickly turned against the Japanese American. A story began to surface about a small conflict that occurred on the island of Niihau. Following the attack at Pearl Harbor, 3 Japanese Americans apparently helped a downed Japanese pilot escape after he was shot down in the attack at the harbor. 2 of the people surrendered, and the pilot was killed while another accomplice committed suicide. This brought panic upon the American people at the moment this news was released. President Roosevelt immediately began feeling pressure to act upon the issue at hand. President Roosevelt thought the best plan of action would be to segregate the Japanese Americans into their own towns, or internment camps.
I was 4 at the time of Pearl Harbor, and I was too young to really understand what was going on. But I still do remember that day when armed soldiers with guns, bayonets on them, came to our home to order us out. I remember that as a very scary day. And, you know, a child can sense your parents' anxieties. And we were taken from our home to a horse stable at Santa Anita Racetrack, where we were housed for a few months while the camps were being built. And when the camp was built, we were put on a train and taken all the way across the southwestern desert to the swamps of Arkansas, a camp called Rower. And I grew up there for a portion of the war, and then we were transferred from that camp to another camp in Northern California called Tule Lake, which was an even more harsh camp. There were 3 levels of barbed wire fence and tanks patrolling the perimeter. And after the war, we came back home to Los Angeles.
On May 19, 1942, Japanese Americans were forced to move into camps by Civilian Restrictive Order No. 18, Federal Regulation 982. This was based on Executive Order 9066 of February 19, 1942. Japanese American Fred Korematsu decided to stay in California, although he knew he violated Civilian Exclusion Order No. 34 of the U.S. Army. Korematsu argued that the order was unconstitutional and that it violated the Fifth Amendment. He was arrested and convicted. Nobody questioned Korematsu of his loyalty to the United States.
When the war broke out, young Japanese American men and women rushed to their local recruitment boards to volunteer to serve in the U.S. Army. But because we looked like the enemy, and simply for that, we were rejected from service. Those that volunteered to serve were classified as 4C, which means enemy non-alien. Now that's a very peculiar term, non-alien. It means a citizen. We couldn't even be called enemy citizens. We were called enemy non-aliens, and they were rejected from service. And we were all incarcerated. But a year into internment, the government realized they had a manpower shortage, and here was all this manpower that we've incarcerated under the label of being potential spies, saboteurs, traitors. How do we tap this manpower? So they came down with what was called a loyalty questionnaire, which in its on the surface sounds outrageous. After they've taken our property, our homes, our businesses, our freedom, and incarcerated us for a year, they want to test our loyalty. It was a series of about 40 questions, and everyone in these internment camps had to respond. Everyone over 17 years of age had to respond to this, answer the questions in the loyalty questionnaire. A 17-year-old girl or a 80-year-old immigrant lady all had to respond to this questionnaire. There were two key questions that the government wanted answers to. Question 27 asked, "Will you bear arms to defend the United States of America?" Can you imagine this question being posed to an 88-year-old immigrant lady or a 17-year-old girl? Question 28, and this was only one sentence, but it had two ideas. It asked, "Will you swear your loyalty to the United States of America and forswear your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan?" Now, for a Japanese American, someone born and raised here, the word forswear your loyalty to the Emperor was very offensive because it assumed that by birth you were ingrained with an inborn loyalty to the Emperor. I mean, you can't forswear something that doesn't exist. So the government assumed that there was an existing loyalty just because we looked like this. And so if you answered no, meaning I don't have a loyalty to the Emperor to forswear, you were also saying no to the first part. Will you swear your loyalty to the United States? If you answered yes, meaning yes, I will be loyal, you were, fessing up that you had been loyal to the Emperor, and the government was justified in putting you in an internment camp. It turned all 10 camps into turmoil.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized the internment with Executive Order 9066, which allowed local military commanders to designate military areas as exclusion zones, from which any or all persons may be excluded. This power was used to declare that all people of Japanese ancestry were excluded from the entire Pacific coast, including all of California and much of Oregon, Washington, and Arizona, except for those in internment camps. In 1944, 2.5 years after Executive Order 9066, President Roosevelt nullified the order. By the end of 1945, the last internment camp was shut down. Due to their enforcement from the U.S., 5,766 Nisei, or those of Japanese descent, renounced their U.S. citizenship. In 1968, the U.S. government began reparations to Japanese Americans for lost property that had occurred during their stay at the camps.
The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 survivors, surviving Japanese Americans, of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. Thank you all again, and God bless you all. I think this is a fine day.